Have you ever walked into a supermarket for one thing and somehow walked out with a giant chocolate bar, cookies, maybe some candies, knowing full well you'll probably regret it later? That used to happen to me every week. And the weirdest part was, I wasn't eating badly. My nutrition was already low carb, intermittent fasting. I loved healthy food. Most days I felt completely in control until suddenly, approximately twice a week, I wasn't. And for years, I thought I had a discipline problem. I didn't know I had ADHD back then. I thought I was just a weak person who's not trying hard enough. Then I learned one thing about dopamine that completely changed how I saw my cravings. Not only did it explain why I kept binging sugary foods, it also showed me why fighting cravings straightforward was never gonna be the answer. And honestly, that realization changed my life. If you are new to this channel, my name is Christina Oz and I speak about how to improve your ADHD with nutrition and particularly how to break free from food addiction while being ADHD. If that sounds like you, subscribe and let's get into the video. Before I understood the logic of why I am relapsing into sugar every week, 2 times a week, I was already in recovery after years of bulimia, where I was using food to cope with anxiety, and I was a few years into low carb diet. That alone took me years of work, but I was already sincerely enjoying the taste of healthy foods. I wasn't buying junk food, I wasn't buying processed food to my home. My nutrition looked clean and healthy according to most of the nutrition guides. So by that point, I genuinely enjoyed healthy food, which made my weekly sugar binges even more confusing. So I was just always blaming it to myself and thinking, if I would just put a little bit more willpower, if I would just hold on a little bit more, if I would use a little more discipline this time, then it would work. But for some reason, that was never the case. I could never outdo it with more discipline or willpower. When I got diagnosed with ADHD, I started learning about ADHD and dopamine relations. One of the characteristics of ADHD is lower dopamine activity, particularly something called tonic dopamine. Tonic dopamine is basically our brain's baseline level of dopamine, a background amount that is produced daily and it's just there throughout the day. And dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical. That is a huge oversimplification. It is already known that dopamine is heavily involved in motivation, drive, taking action, and being able to prioritize things and focus on completing the task. It's what makes you think that this task is worth doing. I want to do that. Let's keep going. It is one of the reasons we are able to pursue things. Now, it's besides tonic dopamine, there is also something called phasic dopamine. These are short bursts or spike of dopamine that happen when something rewarding, exciting, or stimulating appears. And if your baseline dopamine is lower, those spikes can feel especially rewarding and noticeable because they change the state of the brain from being understimulated, under-focused. Our brain suddenly gets the burst of dopamine, which increases its level, making us more focused, more alert, and able to pursue things, even if for a short amount of time. And because dopamine is also deeply involved in learning, our brain is making associations. So our brain goes like, oh, I feel better. Let's remember this. If you've ever felt tired, bored, overwhelmed, understimulated, sad, needing rest, and used food to cope with all of that, your brain learned that this is the quickest and the most efficient way to change your state immediately. This is why sugar and highly processed foods are so powerful. And this is why food addiction is so powerful. Because they are incredibly accessible and quick sources of dopamine. That is why they are called cheap dopamine, because they are available almost everywhere. Their price is low. They require almost no effort of obtaining, and they can change the way we feel in seconds. You feel better almost immediately by eating sugary or processed foods. You feel more stimulated, more alert, maybe more calm, more focused. And in ADHD brain, that change in state feel especially noticeable because we are starting at a lower baseline. But then, minutes later, the dopamine spike fades, and suddenly we want another hit to feel good again. This is why cravings can feel so intensely overwhelming, because they're not simply cravings for taste. They're cravings for a change in biochemistry, for a change in state. And our brain remembers that it made us feel better. That is undeniable fact, even if for a short amount of time. So it wants to repeat the experience whenever we feel those emotion or states again. It is its own self-medication. So here is the realization that completely changed my life. I wasn't craving chocolate. I was craving dopamine. And chocolate was simply the delivery system. And once you understand that all the dopamine is equal in our brain, you can stop asking yourself, why am I so weak around food? How do I stop overeating? You can start searching for other dopamine sources. So I stopped asking, how do I stop eating sugary foods? And started asking, how do I give my brain, myself, what I really need? What is my brain actually trying to get from the food? In any given moment, I have a craving. And honestly, it was one of the most freeing realizations I've ever had. Understanding lower basal dopamine levels in ADHD brain, it also explains something else. Why people with ADHD are much more vulnerable to addiction in general. Because the common thread is searching for dopamine. An ADHD brain naturally gravitates towards things that reliably and quickly give us stimulation. And sugary and processed food is one of the easiest and cheapest dopamine sources available, besides social media scroll. You don't have to plan anything, you don't have to learn a new skill, you don't have to leave your house, you don't have to engage with any human being. You just unwrap a chocolate bar, and 10 seconds later, your brain starts feeling different. That is incredibly powerful. So eventually, in ADHD brain, food stops being just food. It becomes a tool for self-regulation, a way to change our state, a way to feel more focused, calmer, a way to feel different. And once I understood that, everything changed because I stopped fighting my sugar cravings directly. And I realized that I didn't have a discipline problem. I had a brain that learned to rely too heavily on this one sugary source of dopamine. And understanding that your brain relies on food to manage its levels of dopamine, it is a very different problem from trying to manage cravings directly. So if sugar and processed food had become one of my primary ways of regulating my mood, stimulation, focus, and energy, then maybe quitting sugar wasn't actually the first problem I needed to solve. So this is where a lot of people accidentally make things harder for themselves, and that is exactly what I was doing to myself too. We declare war on sugar and food. No more sweets, trying to cut sugar cold turkey. We need to realize something important. In context of ADHD brain and constant sugar cravings, sugar is doing a job. Most of the times, it is an emergency source of dopamine, and taking it away overnight without replacing it is not a good idea. It is like taking away someone's crutch before their leg had healed. Of course, we will feel worse. Of course, we will crave it even more. And of course, we will relapse if we don't find other sources of dopamine. If your brain used food this way for years, most probably it doesn't know any better. So your brain is not trying to sabotage you, it is trying to help us better. with the tools and sources and resources that we have available. So instead of asking, how do I stop eating sugary foods? I started asking a completely different question. What other sources of dopamine do I want in my life? That question changes whole perspective, because then it is not about food anymore at all. We need to admit that sugar is a quick pleasure in our life. And our goal is not to remove pleasure in our life. Our goal is to find other sources of pleasure. If you cut out your main pleasure from your life, it is gonna be extremely hard to live. You need to find new sources. So the goal before trying to cut sugar strictly is to diversify dopamine sources as much as possible. Find new ways to feel good. Instead of trying to build a sugar-free life, start trying to build a richer life. Having more walks, being more often in nature, having more hobbies or spending more times with your hobbies, learning more of the things that we are really interested in, spending more time with people that we like or we are inspired from, being more creative, visiting more new places, trying more new activities, making more things that make us feel alive, like we are living this life, not just existing. Doing anything it requires to get non-food pleasure in your life. So if our goal is to really get rid of sugar in our life, to improve our health, our mind, our well-being, the first step should be to not replace sugar directly, but to expand our sources of dopamine and expand our vision of sources of dopamine. We need to start seeing that food and other cheap dopamines, they are not the only source of dopamine. Real dopamine comes from accomplishing things that are important to us. Real dopamine comes from making real progress in our life. Real dopamine comes from moving towards our dreams, making more meaningful connections, using our potential more, creating a life that we sincerely want to live. That is how your cravings for sugary foods will start fading, because in that case food stops carrying the responsibility of being your main source of pleasure, comfort, focus, stimulation, anti-stress, anti-anxiety, everything. It is like real food addiction and sugar addiction recovery isn't about eating less chocolate in the first place. It is about making yourself need it less. And I think that is an important distinction, because food addiction is not only a food problem. I think most of the times it is a life problem that expresses itself through food as the most available, our easiest source of pleasure and stimulation. So when your life becomes richer, food naturally takes smaller place in that. And now you can actually start making healthier nutrition choices to really nourish your body, not to only manage your brain state with food, but to actually sustain your body in a way that supports your well-being, not steals from it. So sugar and processed food cravings were never really about food. It is our brain asking for dopamine using the fastest and most available source it had found. Understanding this doesn't fix everything overnight, but it completely changes the question you're asking, and it changes the direction that you need to start looking to. So I want to leave you with one question. If food suddenly stopped being your main source of dopamine, what would you want to fill your life instead? What moments of joy would you like to experience? How would you like to spend your time? What would you like to achieve? What would motivate you through your day and waking up in the morning? Because the goal isn't to become someone who never craves chocolate. Our goal is to build a life that is so rich, so interesting, and so meaningful that food no longer has to do all the heavy lifting, and it starts being just the food, nourishment, nothing more than that. And I think that is where the real food freedom begins. Not fighting your brain, but understanding it and then giving it something better to live for. If this video resonated with you, I'd genuinely love to hear your experience in the comments. And in the next video, we're going to talk about something that makes all of this even harder. Why modern processed food is deliberately engineered to keep us coming back for more, which makes it for our ADHD brain even harder to quit. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you are subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.